This is a paid program and is provided for informational purposes only.
Now on 960 The Patriot, it's the Middle East Radio Forum. Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Mir Jolovitz.
Hi, this is David Rothschild sitting in for Mir Jolovitz of the Middle East Radio Forum. Welcome. And today we are going to have Devin Sper as our guest to talk about Israel, the wall, and walls in general in international affairs. We're going to be talking to Devin Sper. Welcome.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Doing all right. Devin is originally from New York. He lived in Israel for 10 years. He has a degree in Jewish history from Hebrew University in Israel, and he is the author of the blog Times of Israel, as well as the author of the book The Future of Israel, which won the 2005 Glyph Awards. Thanks for coming in and being with us in studio today, Devin.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to be here.
Today we wanted to talk about walls. So let's we're talking about a solid subject. We're talking about concrete and steel here. As most of you know, there was a barrier, a wall that was built by Israel to help curtail the suicide bombers that was running not only the extent of between Israel and what the international community calls the occupied territories or the West Bank, but also around Gaza. How did Israel's wall come about, their most noted one that we see in the news and in the pictures?
Well, first of all, to go back a bit, Israel has been at war and been under siege for 70 years since her creation by the countries around her, so naturally she had to have some sort of barrier. And more recently, in recent decades, having lost 5 wars, her enemies turned to terrorism. And so she, one by one on each front, had to build barriers against various terrorist organizations who will infiltrate and commit suicide bombings and murder. And this reached a crescendo in the years 2000 to 2004. And in those 4 years, over 500 Israelis were killed in 132 Palestinian suicide bombings.
So this was not soldiers dressed in Palestinian uniforms or anything attacking into Israel. How were these people that were causing these attacks? How were they committing the attacks, and how were they coming into Israel?
Well, in many cases, they would take a taxi or drive a car from Palestinian areas where they lived. And as there was no border, really, they would just go to a city and blow up the car, blow up themselves, go into a shopping mall, shoot people. And in the month of March 2002 alone, 140 Israelis were killed in this way.
So these were people with suicide vests and guns and so on, just kind of rolling over the border into Israel and killing people.
Correct.
So what were Israel's responses before they came up with the idea of a wall?
They really didn't have a good response. You can't know who is going to come across and do something like that, particularly if they're suicidal. You can't deter them. But what they noticed is that only one in all this period came from Gaza. And Gaza, there was a wall around Gaza, not a wall, a fence around Gaza this whole time, and they realized that was the reason. And they then started building the wall that you talked about, the one they're most well known for, facing the Palestinian areas of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria.
Right. Whenever there was the fence around Gaza, was it Gaza or was it the West Bank that they weren't coming from?
From Gaza.
From Gaza. I remember the fence. They had 3 layers of barbed wire with smooth soil in between the fences that you could see if anyone crossed it. It would leave footprints that they would grade it regularly with this sand so they could see it, and they would run trucks along it to patrol it. And so that fence, that triple layer fence line, was a predecessor then to the current wall structure.
Actually, that is the wall structure for 97% of the borders of Israel. The 3% that you always see shown in the media is this big cement wall, and that looks foreboding and that looks dramatic, so the press always shows you that. But reality is...
Makes for good pictures.
Right. Right. In fact, even in my article in the Arizona Republic, where I'm explaining this, they still put a picture showing that. But the only reason there is a cement barrier at all is in built-up areas or over roads where Palestinian snipers had regularly been shooting Israeli civilians. And so the purpose of the cement wall is to deflect sniper fire. But 97% of the walls around Israel are not actually walls. They're just as you described them. Plus, they have sensors. And the purpose of these barriers is not to stop someone. Anyone can cut through the chain link fence and walk across the dirt road. But they've been found by the sensor. Their tracks are in the dirt road, and they don't get very far. So the object is not to stop them, but more to deter and track them.
So when was the wall built? How long did it take to build? And that how do we get to where we are?
Well, that's a good question. It took basically 7 years total, but that's primarily because the project originally wasn't supposed to surround the whole country. But as one terrorist organization popped up in her borders after another, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they had to build one against Lebanon. In Sinai, they had a wall that was only there against illegal immigration, but now ISIS is in Sinai, so they needed that. Now they're finally building the last section against the Jordanian border in the Arava, which was peaceful. Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan, but again, ISIS is active in all these areas, and so now they've had to build it there. So little by little, over 7 years, they built this wall, but the whole thing took 7 years. It was not very difficult. As we said, it's a dirt road and a chain link fence with some sensors.
Now, you mentioned that the border with Jordan was peaceful, and it used to be that the border with Jordan, again, you had this kind of security fence area, but the Israelis and the Jordanians would use the same radio frequency, so that even though they weren't technically cooperating, if one group was tracking someone, the other side could hear them and could be waiting there to catch them. Is that kind of thing still going on?
I believe that, yes. There was a turn for the worse when there was an incident at the Israeli embassy in Jordan a while ago. We don't need to go into that. It's a whole different subject. But beside that, basically, the problem is not with the government of Jordan. The problem is with terrorist organizations that operate inside Jordan, like ISIS, like Palestinian terrorist organizations, against the will of the Jordanian government. But they don't control everything.
They're as dangerous to the Jordanian government as they are to Israel.
Yeah, well, we know what ISIS is. It's dangerous to all human life.
Right. So now this brings, and I said we're going to be talking about walls in general. Our president of the United States now, President Trump, is talking about a barrier and building a barrier to help control our issues on our southern border. Has the wall been effective for Israel? Has the fencing and patrolling been curtailed a lot of the problems there?
That's a very good question, and I can give you a definite answer, which is yes. And let me give you some examples of that. So I mentioned that in March 2002 alone, 140 Israelis were killed in Palestinian suicide bombs. The year after the war was completed, 15 Israelis were killed in the entire year. So over 500 Israelis in the 4 years, 2000 to 2004. 2009, the wall is completed. 15 Israelis are killed, and all 15 of those were killed by terrorists who came in through gaps that had not yet been completed in the wall.
So they were doing end runs around the areas that had been secured by physical barriers.
Yes, because there were parts they thought walls were not necessary, and gradually they've had to fence off all these areas. Now, there's also a question of the southern wall, which faces Sinai, which was built primarily not as an anti-terrorist wall, but in order to keep out immigrants. And as surprising as it sounds, Israel had a problem of Muslim illegal immigration to Israel from North Africa and Africa. And these people were coming in the tens of thousands. A total of 53,000 of them arrived in Israel. And although they had no support in Israel, they were outside the legal system, I guess life in Israel was better for them than whatever they were leaving behind. and they crossed vast deserts and minefields and war zones to get to Israel. But the Israelis, it's a small country. They don't have a place for these people. They don't have a means to keep them alive. And so they built a fence originally to keep them out. And to come back to your question about effectiveness, so hundreds of them were coming across the border every month. And when this wall was completed recently, the number went down to 6 people for the year, and none of those 6 reached Israeli cities.
So what kind of a structure is this on that border with Sinai? Is that still the triple-layer fence with sensors, or is it?
It's exactly the fence with a dirt road. There is no concrete barrier there.
Who does the patrolling of this in those border areas? Is that the same? Is that still the Army, or is that like the Mishmar, the police, or is there some other?
There's a special part of the Army called Mishmar HaGvul, which is the Border Patrol. And they are primarily made of Druze, which are Muslims who serve in the Israeli Army.
So you've got Druze who are Muslims serving in the Israeli army that are the bulk of the personnel for this section of the Israeli military that does border patrol?
I believe so, yes.
So Israel was not just suffering from a terrorism problem. They were also suffering from the economic problem of unwanted or unmanageable immigration.
Yes, in particular in the longest border, the border between the Negev Desert and the Sinai Desert that we were just discussing, not only did you have the problem of illegal immigration, you had the problem of drug smuggling, of human trafficking, the same problems we have on our border with Mexico.
Well, Milton Friedman said that you can either have a generous social safety net or open immigration, but you can't have both. But we'll come back to that after the break. Hi, this is David Rothschild sitting in for Mayor Jolovitz, the Middle East Radio Forum. We have as our guest today Devin Sper, and we're talking about walls. And this program is made possible by our advertisers. Bill has a number of good advertisers who have been with us for years. I know Bill always uses them for their products personally. And so if you enjoy the Middle East Radio Forum and you enjoy the great guests we're able to bring in, then please not only use the sponsors of the show, but let them know you heard about it on Middle East Radio Forum. Devin, we left off talking about the wall and whether or not the barrier has been effective, and it looks like it has been effective in reducing not only the terrorism problems, but the immigration and economic problems as well on that southern border with Sinai.
Well, President Trump pointed that out when he was talking to the president of Mexico recently. And he said, I'll quote him, Israel has a wall. And everyone said, do not build a wall. Walls don't work. 99.9% of the people trying to come across that wall cannot get across. So, yes, it's effective. And the president of the United States knows this. And he knows that, contrary to what many people say, it can be done.
So essentially these people who are claiming that it's physically impossible to cover that much territory with a wall or that much territory with a physical barrier, that's simply not true. It's intellectually dishonest to argue that.
Yes, absolutely, because the Israeli case has shown already that it is certainly possible to do it, and in short order.
And the next arguments that they raise are that it wouldn't work, it's not effective, but again, in Israel, it looks like at least Israel's version has been largely effective.
It has been close to 100% effective, as per the statistics we talked about earlier. And there is no reason in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of effectiveness, that this couldn't be built. And I would add that if Israel, with their limited resources, can do it, certainly the United States can do it.
I think we've already discussed something that I want to come back to because I think it's an important point, is that the people who keep calling these walls, both in Israel and here in discussions of potential border control, they call it a wall because they know that that is a rhetorical device. We're not, in Israel it isn't, and we're not talking about an actual wall. I think it would be more accurate to say a physical barrier, because in so many places it's 3 strings of chain link fence with sensors or something of that nature. It's not it's a very different matter than building a giant concrete wall like the Wall of China the entire way. That didn't happen in Israel. I don't think anybody's talking about it here, but using that wall language makes it seem more impossible.
And in fact, it's not called a wall in Israel. I'm referring to that. I'm using that word because that's the terms of the debate in this country. In Israel, it's called a security barrier.
So again, if we started talking about having a security barrier here, it would could be very effective, could be much more physically doable than to pour enough concrete that it could be seen from space.
Yes. As President Trump recently pointed out when I heard him interviewed on this, he said, you want the wall transparent. You want to see what's going on the other side. And so a fence allows you to do that. People approaching the wall are visible. They're visible to sensors, to cameras, and you don't want a concrete wall, except, as I said, if you're worried about sniper fire or something like that.
Right, and we've seen samples of sample walls being built or architectural designs being laid. That's probably for those areas where a fence is either impossible or impractical because of the height of buildings and things like that. So somewhere where cities are up against each other, like in Tijuana. And
I imagine that would be the purpose of it.
Obviously, we don't have access to any special information, but that one would think logically that would probably be where you would see something like that.
There's another aspect to it that I should point out, which is what happens under the ground. Now, Gaza is a sandy soil, much like the border with Mexico. And the Hamas has built dozens of terror tunnels in which they would come across with the objective of kidnapping Israeli civilians. In one case, they tunneled right under a nursery school. And in those tunnels, when the Israelis went in during the war, they found handcuffs and chains which were made to capture those people down into the tunnels and hold them for ransom or kill them. And so Israel only recently has found technical solutions to that. And now they're extending their wall around Gaza, which has existed for many years, under the ground with sensors, so it would detect anyone who's trying to tunnel across. And I think that experience will be helpful for us because the same thing is possible. There are drug tunnels coming into the United States, which could, of course, be used by terrorists as well. And so that problem also is soluble. Israel has shown that.
And we're using techniques like ground-penetrating radar and things like that to detect those in the U.S. I assume the same things were done in Israel.
They don't say what sensors. I would guess sound sensors, people digging against rock, and vibration sensors, and you would figure out, if anyone is there. What I can tell you is that all of a sudden, all these tunnels that the Palestinians are working on started to collapse one after the other, and all with the people digging them inside. And it seems like a big coincidence. And these are reinforced with concrete domes. So the fact that they collapsed, I don't know. The Israelis seem able to detect them and destroy them at will now.
Well, and again, they share most of that technology with us, so I'm sure the same thing should be available. So really, it's not a matter of that a physical barrier is technically not feasible or is ineffective, that it won't work. It's really a question of, if they want to be intellectually honest, it's a question of should we build a wall or not. It's a moral and philosophical question rather than a logistics question.
I completely agree, and I wish that the entire debate was that sort of intellectually honest debate, because it's not. Right now, everyone talks about the impossibility when they really mean they don't want it or they're in principle against it. I think those people who are against the wall should say so. They should say that we are on moral principle against the wall, and we can have that debate, and we can have it here. But they are afraid to have that debate because it's, I think, hard to defend.
Well, it's hard to defend at this point in time, but there are longstanding, very good moral arguments against it. It's long been the United States policy ever since the Cold War to kind of generally knee-jerk be against walls of all kinds ever since what happened in East Berlin. And so the wall that was set up and the fencing that was set up by the Iron Curtain countries to trap and keep their citizens in and keep them from fleeing, the United States fought against that for the whole Cold War and took a position that having walls was morally indefensible. And so anytime they see anybody building a wall, well, the policy manual book says we're against that. And so there's kind of knee jerk against it. But is that the same situation here?
I think so. In fact, you bring up a good point. I hadn't thought about the Berlin Wall, and I think that is part of the problem. But what I want to say is that we live in a different world, that we live in a world where there is mass illegal migration caused by failed states in South America, in the Middle East. You've seen the streams of millions of people pouring out of the countries they live in. It's a world of drug smuggling, of international terrorism, which we didn't have back in those days. And therefore, to me, a country that doesn't control its borders is not a country, and it's not doing justice to its citizens.
Well, also it's a distinction of those walls were built to keep people in. So in other words, you're not talking about building a defensive wall, you're talking about building a prison wall to keep people in. And I haven't heard anybody raise the argument yet, but it's something that I've been thinking about, that I'm not so sure that we want a wall here for the same reason. In other words, if we build a wall or a fence, let's say along the southern border, where it's stating to keep people out, if things get very bad here or something starts to go horribly awry, it could be used to keep us in.
Well, we don't have that form of government that would keep us in, and I don't think that's really what this is about. And I agree with you. It's about keeping people out, which is morally different than keeping them in.
And at least for now, and we hope it stays that way. And we'll come back to that when we come back from this break. Devin, we were just talking about before the break the wall and the concern that I have that I haven't heard anybody else express yet, that walls are used both to keep people out, which is what the wall in Israel is about, and the kind of security barrier that Trump has been talking about to keep people out. But historically, these kind of barriers have been used to keep people in both in Germany and East Berlin, and I guess does it all just depend on which way the barbed wire is pointing?
No, it depends on the nature of the government. And in a totalitarian state, they're going to try to keep people in. But in a democracy, there's no reason anyone would do that.
So it's
in other words, I don't think it's a concern here.
At least not yet.
No,
so
not for the foreseeable future.
In some of the barriers that have been erected in the past, they also included things like minefields and deadly traps. Those aren't employed on the wall in Israel, are they?
No. No. As I said, it doesn't really keep anyone out. It simply detects them crossing the border and allows the Border Patrol to catch up with them. It's not really intended for that purpose. Also, in wars, which Israel faces regular wars with standing armies of her neighbors, she can't put minefields necessarily in front of her own troops who are going to go forward. So there are minefields on the Golan Heights against the Syrian army, but that's a different story.
Well, minefield, again, and that's, as you say, a different story, and mines are used in warfare not as barriers, but as channeling systems to force the enemy's troops to come into an area where you want them to be instead of coming from areas that are unexpected.
That's exactly right, yes.
So Israel has had this barrier, combination wall fence barrier, since the mid-2000s now?
Yes.
Are there any lessons or things that they have learned about that you think might be applicable to what we're looking to try to do on the southern border?
I think quite a few. There is the overarching fact that they succeeded in building it in a couple of years, that it came in under budget and on time, that it really wasn't very expensive, and it's extremely popular in Israel for that reason. There was controversy over it there too, the way there is here now. But it's very popular in Israel because people saw the effect where the terrorism went down, the illegal immigration went down, drug smuggling and human trafficking all ended almost overnight. And so the Labor Party that you mentioned earlier, the Israeli left, which now calls itself the Zionist Union, the head of the Labor Party, former head Isaac Herzog, said, I'll quote him, once there's less terror, there's more ability to talk. And so the Labour Party is even more enthusiastic about building the wall in Israel than is the government. And so it's one of the few things on which there is national consensus in Israel.
Safety will bring that.
Yes, people not being blown up is better than people being blown up.
Here in the United States, again, there, at least so far, hasn't been that issue of suicide bombers and attacks that are costing lives. So right now it's really an economic and national really identity issue, which is that a country that doesn't take care of its borders is no longer really a country. There are some other things that countries can do to take care of that rather than the security issue. Like we talked about the social safety net. If you have the entire southern continent with a low standard of living and a generous social safety net with schools and free treatment in hospitals and housing and all these other benefits, what comes for free, quote unquote, free from the government here gives a higher standard of living than they can get anywhere else without having to do anything for it. If we cut off access to all of that so that someone who came here couldn't access all the social benefits, wouldn't that be very effective in reducing the number of people who tried to come here without even need for a wall?
As far as illegal immigration, yes. As far as drug smuggling, as far as terrorism, no. And I'd like to comment on what you just said in that regard, that we haven't had an issue of terrorists coming across the border, which is true. But it seems inevitable that you have drug tunnels and drug cartels who will eventually make common cause with Middle Eastern terrorists and rent them and allow them use of their tunnels. And when that happens, that's a disaster. And so I think it's absolutely inevitable that will happen. And from a security position alone, as you said, a government that doesn't control its borders is not a government. A country that doesn't have borders is not a country.
Well, the drug dealers are in it for the money. If they can get paid by terrorists, I'm sure they'll be willing to take their money. But building a wall before we have people lying dead in the streets would require us to be proactive. And since when are we ever do that? But we'll maybe answer that when we come back on the Middle East Radio Forum. We were talking about building a wall or building a barrier here in the United States proactively before the terrorism hits. I don't know how many times we've actually been able to be proactive and prevent something in the past, but the debate here might turn once that Hezbollah, who has hired the drug cartels to let them move a dirty bomb into the southern United States, southwestern United States, then the debate regarding the wall might change dramatically.
Let me say a dirty bomb is very scary, but it doesn't even have to be that. Let's say they infiltrate 500 terrorists into San Diego, all attack at the same time. The police are not equipped to handle that. No one is equipped to handle that. That in itself would be a disaster, and it's very, very doable.
Well, how many times can the Coyotes smuggle in 500 illegal immigrants from South America?
Right, and how much cocaine and how many kilos of cocaine do they smuggle in? How about weapons? And obviously, if they can smuggle in cocaine and weapons and in people, they can smuggle in terrorists.
And all it takes is for the Hezbollah to use some of the millions of dollars that the Obama administration let Iran have to turn right back around, go into the pockets of the Coyotes to smuggle in whatever the Iranian Revolutionary Guard wants to smuggle in.
There was the bombing of the Jewish Center in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, killed hundreds of people. There have been similar things in South America. It hasn't been here yet, but it seems to me absolutely inevitable and a matter of time with an open border that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and all these organizations that seek our destruction will take advantage of that opportunity.
And that is a disturbing thought indeed, and I think we've probably got some questions.